So the first time I saw that movie by Kalman and Whitney was actually here, maybe there, and they were showing Blondes in the Jungle, which was our first feature-length movie. Yeah. So well, that's more or less as I guess we can describe it, a bunch of people kind of looking for the fountain of youth in the jungles in Honduras, but it kind of almost has this feel of like walking down, let's say, East Village. But and then that's sort of set in the 80s, and then Alpha Leisure is set in the 80s, and so you go to another decade.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to start by asking what was that transition like, and how many years did it take for you guys to go from Blondes in the Jungle to get to L for Leisure?
Let me think. We finished Blondes in the Jungle around 2009, and when we made it, we didn't know anything about, like, we'd never really shown our films anywhere. We'd been making short films, but just for our friends. And so then we made Blondes, and it started to travel, and it kind of went to a lot of festivals and galleries and stuff like that. And so that like took us to 2010, and we started to write a feature. And we knew we didn't have the money to make a feature.
Okay.
And we knew that we wouldn't be given it. So we tried to think of a project that we could kind of do in little like affordable bite-sized bunches, and that would kind of like take a while, and that would be okay. That like the fact that like we were like, all right, a feature is going to take like 4 years. So like what kind of feature can be made over 4 years and like work? And that's, we kind of had like, we had already been sitting on the idea of doing like a movie that went to every vacation. So like it became the project for that, where we'd kind of like start taking us through vacations. So Blondes ended in 2009, and we premiered L for Leisure about a year and a half ago in 2014. So it was a 5-year process in between there.
Yeah. So we'll be kind of like, do you think the sort of, I guess, like dealing with the possibilities, limitations that you had in terms of whatever, let's say, because in a way, like Blondes in the Jungle is way more like a linear sort of a narrative, and this is more episodic, and you have like these vignettes and happen. Different locations, different places with different people.
Yeah.
So was that something that you were actually thinking about when you started thinking about the film, but also like, or that was kind of also a response to what you had to deal with as a way of sort of like thinking through the process?
No, I think it was like a problem, like a thing that we tried to deal with in Blondes in the Jungle, that we tried to deal with in doing more sort of emphatic, alienating devices in that movie, right? We do a lot more sort of like just cutting sound completely out during narrative scenes and stuff like that. Because like a thing that we want to make sure is clear is that we are not trying to just kind of get people to be attached to the characters and follow their arcs. And we always want to be kind of pulling people into noticing the context of the characters, and also the kind of broader context of the making of the film and everything. And so with making a longer feature, so Blondes, the reason I called it sort of a feature is that it's 48 minutes. Yeah. So with L for Leisure, when we were like, all right, we're going to make a thing that's more like the length of a regular feature, we were like, how do we avoid, again, that problem of people suddenly following these characters and liking or disliking those characters? And so we thought of all these sort of devices that would be like, oh, we'll have 2 characters that are more or less the same. Or we'll have a character who's in there and seems important and then never shows up again. And like, so all these other different kinds of ways that we could sort of kind of keep the attention on the vibe of the movie instead of on the stories of the individual characters, and at the same time have them kind of feel real. Yeah. So like the episodic structure is kind of like, we knew that we needed to scale up from Blondes in some way, and we didn't want to scale towards normal.
Yeah, so you just want to like blow up.
Yeah, it's like we exploded Blondes and they became like 5 different people.
I guess what I wanted to ask you is kind of like a bit about the writing process, because I'm curious if, I mean, it seems like that the movie's like tightly scripted.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to kind of like ask you about it, if you're writing for particular characters or writing for particular, let's say, actors, how did that come about? And was there anything that would happen sort of on the scene or on the set, or it was all,
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, like, so, yeah, the movie, just because of, like, the way we like to work, and especially working with non-actors, like it's a pain to be like, all right, what do you think the scene should be? Like it's a much more helpful thing to like kind of be like, it's gonna be okay if you say these words and you say them the way you want, and like we can kind of like work with them better if we do have a tight script to work with. But at the same time, like another kind of idea that we had with this film was that we were like, we don't want to get, you know, when we wrote Blondes, it was like we wrote Blondes and then we spent a year trying to get money together for Blondes, and then by the time we shot it, we just couldn't stand the script anymore. I mean, like it had just gotten stale for us. So like we were like, oh, let's try to do something where we're writing all the time and shooting all the time and everything. So with this film, like some of the last scenes were written like right as we were shooting them, and some things were kind of like in place all the time. And then also like, yeah, it depends on who we're working with. Like the basketball scene, we more or less let those guys write it. Yeah, because like, or like especially Andy, the guy who's holding the beer, he's been in like every one of our films since we were 18, and so he knows what kind of dialogue we want, and he has got a deeper knowledge of basketball than I do, and so we were like, just go ahead and write your dialogue, and so then we started working with that, and we like knew that he would be working on. Like that Benny, the counterpart with the beard, that he was going to be talking about Michael Jordan and blackness and jazz. And so we were just like, all right, work with that and start going. So that was a lot more of a kind of improvised scene. And like, you know, we like shot a lot of film on that one, but other ones we kind of just gave people the exact script. You know, we're just like sensitive to who we're working with.
Well, I mean, like now that you talk about, you know, you took several shots of that particular scene. I guess one thing that happens is that there's a lot of sort of off-scene dialogue. So there's a lot of, how did you make the sound? Is it like, did you, because I think the film is shot in 16 millimeter, and then you recorded the sound digitally, and was there any dubbing done afterwards?
Oh, yeah.
How did you deal with the
sound?
Like
usually the way that we work is, our camera that we shot this with and Blondes with as well is pretty noisy. So like, I don't know, 8 times out of 10, we can't use the actual sound from the actual take. And that just kind of like frees us up, that we're never sort of like, oh, well, it has to sound the way it did. Like the dialogue has to be what it was. Like we just never sort of think that way. So like, yeah, every time we shoot, we also do a few more sound takes. We try some alternate lines. We're just kind of like digital recordings are cheap and the film recordings are really expensive. So like we like get the take for picture, and then we're kind of like, yeah, and the sound can be whatever we want. And so we're always kind of thinking and recording the sound separately. And like, yeah, the dialogue was the Mexico scene. That monologue was re-recorded like 3 or 4 times because we kept changing it and sending him a new script. And that last version that we hear is actually the version that he sent us over Skype of him trying it out and being like, is this what you guys want? And we were like, yeah, that's what we want, and it's perfect.
Sounds great. The other thing is like the locations. I guess like one thing that happens is that you have this very kind of like sublime sort of landscape that's juxtaposed with, I guess it's sort of like brainy intellectualism, or kind of like, I guess that sometimes it's not, but it's just like going back and forth between sort of scenery and then going like this over this narrative that goes on top of it. So, and at times it's just, you get really obsessed, I guess, with, you know, you get really focused on basically making these beautiful sort of landscape shots. Yeah. I wondered, like, how did that come about? Because that's, I mean, in Blondes in the Jungle, obviously you are already set in this sort of location that is, you know, really amazing. And then here, I guess like the location hunting really becomes a part of the structure of the film itself.
Yeah, it would be like absolutely like the way we'd be thinking about it was like, okay, we have the France scene coming up, and that would be like, who do you put in the France scene? But the France scene has to happen. Like you think of the movie as a sort of map of this world that graduate students of like sort of like affordable vacation spots around the early 90s and like places that they could be. And so like, yeah, we were always thinking about like where that could happen. And I think it's also part of what we're trying to do of sort of like, I don't know, pulling attention, being like, you know, we on one hand want people to listen to the dialogue, but at the same time to be like, what are they talking about? Like, what's all this going on over here? And looking at the location. Yeah. I think we have like, we're trying to work with a few different rhythms in the movie. And one is the sort of landscape, another one is the sort of heady dialogue, another one is the sort of music video vibe that comes in.
If we go to the heady dialogue, I guess, I mean, you've talked about like with Stillman and people that you have sort of like looked at in your filmmaking, but something that I think is really interesting in your work is that, like you think about, you know, Metropolitan and films like that, there's still a kind of like a, let's say, kind of an aspiration or kind of like, let's say, desire, and there's like frustrations and sort of ideas about trying to get somewhere, and there's frustration about class or, and these people are worried about their future. I mean, what you see in this film is that there is like maybe similarity about where they're coming from, and but you don't have, it seems like they're not trying at all. The characters are just not trying. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I mean, like, I think that that's sort of, yeah, kind of the big project of L for Leisure is sort of,
Yeah.
I think you're kind of touching on, right? Is that like, and, you know, like, I'm not sure I can talk about it better than I can make the movie, but like,
Yeah.
then like what we're trying to show is like this sort of, like, I think there's a little bit of a, you know, like, what still gets me about the movie, and we're making another movie that's set in the past, because it's like, on one hand, how do you deal with people who are optimistic and sincere and like thinking about their world, and on the other hand, we know exactly what's going to happen to them, and that they kind of are like right in the midst of a totally ineffectual generation that like kind of like set the world that we were living in, like in the early 2000s, sort of like this is like the Bush era is the baby of these guys, and like, so like how do we like deal with the fact that like on one hand like anything can happen in the future, and on the other hand they're like kind of doomed.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's like that, trying to find a way to talk about that and trying to keep both perspectives alive at once is like what motivates us through all of our sort of like why we're trying to pull people back and forth out of the characters or trying to show this world. Like, yeah, so it's like, how do you show people who are both ambitious and yet obviously not gonna, like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like it's something that I guess another device that you use, I mean, is sort of this idea of creating this kind of distance, and you know, you've talked about TV a lot, but I mean, it reminded me of something like, you know, David Foster Wallace talks about this sort of idea of like TV folding onto itself, and sort of it becomes it, you know, whatever like literary criticism tries to do will never attain what TV is actually doing to itself already.
Yeah.
And a lot of the film sort of at times seems like it's actually not about the references, but it's about the references of the reference. So it's like a degree removed. So you have like a high school drama. It's I guess you guys are more looking at the film about the high school drama, or you're looking at like Warhol, or looking at something that is already, the distance is involved in your references, like pointing to something else.
Yeah.
And I feel, I guess something I was thinking was like even like the period idea might be related to creating that distance. So maybe you put the 90s as a device, or you put the 80s as a device, but whereas you're talking about maybe a lot of things that you might resonate already. So yeah, I mean, like that's...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just another way of, I think setting the movie in a period is like another way of sort of making the audience aware that we are trying to talk about something in specific and not just recreate a world, right? And not just, or present a sort of mirror or a window onto a world that they're seeing, but that instead we're kind of constructing a sort of like, pay attention to this and pay attention to that. And yeah, setting it in the past and kind of setting it in a moment where there is like a kind of new field of references to open out for people is like it's a great device to use to kind of help along with our project.
Well, I guess the other thing that it seems like there's this kind of like implicit kind of sexuality is sort of like sprinkled or sort of like sprayed over the sort of film, but kind of like, and the dialogue's kind of like, you know, like something. I mean, I guess like somehow, I guess you can think about like some Warhol movies, or also like maybe porn, like in a way that you have a structure, you talk about something, and then you just move to the next thing. I guess like in your film, nothing really happens, but can you talk about the dialogues a bit more?
You know, during the formative years of me and Whitney kind of getting to make films, we watched a lot of like Skinamax, and at the same time Warhol and all of that. And there's just something so nice about the way that the dialogue doesn't serve the function that it does in a drama, where the dialogue instead can kind of like be more of a behavior and less of a thing that like is illustrating this or that about a character or moving the plot forward or this or that way. It kind of falls back to sort of like people being like, hello, hey, how are you? And all these
Yeah.
great things that don't happen in movies where they just walk in and they're like, the president's been killed, and like it keeps going, right? Like where here it's like someone would be like, hey, what's up, you know?
Yeah.
Nothing, the president's been, you know, it's just kind of like it gets us, it kind of like goes back into the sort of rhythm. It's like both, you know, I think another kind of thing that we're trying to find is like, what's the thing that's both more like bad acting or both more like porn or whatever it is, and also more like the way that life is.
Yeah.
You know, so it kind of both, when you're watching it, you feel like, oh, this isn't coming off right, and then you're like, oh, I find myself saying these exact same things all the time.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was looking at leisure, and it seems like, other than, like, some activity that you would do when you're not working, also, like, it seems like it kind of also means finding something to do. And I found that really interesting, because, like, I feel like kind of it's really a challenge to make people who are just hanging out, like a bunch of people hanging out, how do you make a movie out of that? Like, how do you make something that basically a bunch of people chilling, how do you make an audience engage? And I think there's a leisure at both ends, in both of the making and the viewership. And I wonder, like, how you were thinking about, like, oh yeah, we want to make a film about, like, a bunch of people almost doing nothing, you know? Mm-hmm. And just hanging.
Yeah, that's the project. Like, yeah, I mean, like we were chatting about how one of my favorite parts of the movie, and it kind of got lost because we brought up the lights and turned down the music and everything, but the credits kind of go on and on. Yeah. And like there's like the music stops and then it like comes back again. And that's sort of my favorite part of the movie. One, because I'm usually not watching the movie, and so I just come in and see that part on the before I do a Q&A. But like, but the other reason being that like it's so indulgent all the way up to the end, where like it kind of maintains this rhythm of leisure, where it's like, you know what, just like one more time. Yeah. And like I think that that's kind of like what we were trying to find a way to keep the movie without making the movie a chore for the audience. How do you also let the movie just kind of enjoy itself? And like, you know, like be like, oh yeah, like let's look around at everyone who's napping and everything, and like how to be uneconomical, you know, in still a kind of short movie.
In a short movie. Yeah. So one thing that I guess I have like a couple more questions, but obviously we can have like if anyone else had any thoughts. Well, one thing is obviously the soundtrack, and I guess John is somewhere around here too. And
he may or may not be. John, are you around here right now? No, he's heard me do a Q&A a lot.
All right. Well, the thing about the soundtrack is like obviously not from the period.
Right.
So and it sounds somewhat contemporary, I would say, and but still, you know, it's again another device that looks like, oh, you're not really like making something that will look or sound like the period. So I wonder like how you came up with it, because you go back and forth from like, let's say kind of like a soundtrack mode to like more a song mode, and then you have a sort of music video situation going on, and then in and out, you know? Yeah,
I mean, the way it happened is, historically, is that for Blondes in the Jungle, John was sort of the music supervisor of that one. And that one, if you guys haven't seen it, is very much like songs. Like everyone's carrying around a tape recorder and they've got a mixtape that they like. And so they're like playing their favorite song on the mixtape. And in this one, we originally were like, John, we want you to do like a score, like really like work on this one. And we realized, like, as we started to work on it, that we just don't think that way. Like, we just think in terms of songs. So the score started to sort of congeal or coagulate, or some more pleasant word, into songs. And then we're like, right, and that song comes back. And at the same time, they're sort of all different versions of each other. And they can kind of all spill into each other. So like they'll have these long intros or outros and stuff where they can kind of start to become score-y. But they just started to become songs, and it was easier for us to think about them in terms of songs. And then once they're songs, then like the music video thing comes naturally, you know, because we're like, why don't we just like spend some time with this song?
Just have fun with it, yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of the last question that I have from my end was that there is something really quintessentially sort of American about your movies. Mm-hmm. And in a way, kind of weirdly, it really reminds me of like, you know, like, kind of like, you know, the anthropological sort of filmmaking. Like, let's say, like, when I was growing up, like, you would have, like, Abbas Kiarostami, who would, like, be a very famous, important filmmaker, but basically the guy's, like, going out, like, making a film about, you know, a boy in a village or something like that, and it comes really naturally. And your films, to me, like, also have that kind of sensibility in a way that I wouldn't be actually shocked if I see this film in that kind of setting as well. Is that something that you have in the back of your mind, and kind of like, I guess, like making films that either sort of open up like some kind of a window to a certain kind of American life? Is that something that you've thought about, or? You know,
it's not something that, I don't know if we're thinking about it or not, but it's definitely something that we've encountered with our films, and that's kind of our favorite part of, this film's like played a whole lot internationally, and we've gotten to travel with it a little bit, and it's the most interesting thing is to see that, especially with international audiences, they're like, oh, so that's what America's like. Yeah. And like, we're like, well, you know, that's what, like, you know, but like, yeah, in a sense, like, that's like us trying to talk about our world and trying to talk about a certain kind of sensibility. And I think it's the kind of thing where, like, you don't even recognize what's sort of the anthropological thing in your film until you see it in another context. Yeah. Like, we had somebody, a friend, who's Chilean, talking to us about the film, and she said that what's so different for her about the film, and she's not like thinking that we made, like, this is just us hanging out or whatever. She understands it's like, but she was saying that nonetheless, just the whole idea that, like, that the intellectual would also be the hipster is like totally unheard of in Chile, because those two things are like, you're either like a party person and a fashion person, or you're like going to school and you're wearing like a tweed jacket, and that those two worlds are totally different. And so, like, just like that kind of sensibility, or the way that people go on vacation, or the way that people, you know, like the things that we talk about, like how people hug or greet or whatever, or sit, like, I mean, like, I think that that's something that I think we've been lucky to sort of like find as what we're interested in making films about. And it's cool that people who don't know that world are actually usually more interested in it than like than other people. We had with Blondes in the Jungle, the worst place it ever plays is New York City. Oh yeah. It's just no one cares. They're like, yeah, that's what life is like. It's no big deal. But like, it's fun in other places.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I guess anyone has any questions? Or should we just keep going, or should we keep chilling?
What made you pick those locations?
The question was, he doesn't have to. The question was what made me pick those locations. Like, half of them were just things that, like, obviously would make sense if you were going to do like a sort of tour of vacation world, and a lot of other ones were like, they were just what happened. Like, we had originally wanted to do for the Christmas scene to do one in Silicon Valley and have it be like a whole Silicon Valley pool party. But then the actor who was going to do that one was like, sorry guys, I got to go to Iceland. And so we just followed him over there and made a scene over there. So some of the like locations came by accident. And by the way, Iceland made a lot more sense for Christmas, and I'm really glad we did that, because then we got to have Santas in it and everything. And we tried to do a sort of like, in the US, tried to do a little bit of sort of like a sprinkling of different kinds of locations in the US, which is why like the only place where we really cheat in the movie is Texas isn't Texas and Florida isn't Florida, but we thought it was important to kind of take you around the like world, especially of like academic stuff and research stuff and sort of the, you know, because like one thing that's weird about graduate students is that they don't get to all just be in LA or New York. They have to go like where the work is, and so like they end up sort of in other places, and so like that was another kind of thing that we were trying to hit with going to all the different locations in the film.
Is there something like, do you think a lot, I mean, given though it's like, it's in this sort of like window of the 90s, but do you think like part of the film is about like, how are you thinking or making sense of this sort of graduate school community now? Because I guess you didn't go to school in the 90s either. I mean, like,
I didn't go to graduate school, period.
Yeah.
No, of course. Like, it's like, it's, one of the impulses for the movie is like, how do we talk about this kind of character, this character who's like aware of every word that's coming out of their mouth, and that like is like, oh, like every word that comes out of my mouth is like both more articulate than like other people would be, but also like totally wrong. And like, how do you kind of do that? And like, we'd sort of been like hanging out with a lot of grad students when we started to write this, and then like sort of the 90s kind of flow into that too, because like that's the moment of the hyper-articulate, like that's when that becomes a pop culture figure, you know, like, so we, like that's a place where we can kind of like have it touch on a whole lot of things.
I mean, it's both like very articulate, but also extremely self-reflexive. You have these people who already like a step ahead of themselves, and like critically, you know, they would know, they would already plan out and know what the problem with their position or line of thinking is, and they, you know, it almost becomes like always. They try to catching up with their own criticality, you know.
Exactly, yeah, and that's why it was fun to kind of have the movie take place with these characters on vacation.
Yeah.
Because at work, presumably, they're more competent at it, you know, like whatever their particular field is, they can sort of like perform a sort of like ability to talk about whatever it is they're interested in. But when they start to relax and be like, it's like if suddenly like, you know, a grad student was like, you know, like I was thinking about Rihanna, and they start to try to do that, but like that's not their field.
Yeah.
And they like just kind of are like, oh, damn it. Like I know everything I'm saying is wrong as I'm saying it, but that's only going to happen in like a vacation type context.
And the thing is like, even though you know everything you're saying is wrong, but also you know everything you're saying is wrong, and you know why, you know?
Yeah,
like,
and at the same time, you can only say words, like you can only do the best you can do.
Yeah.
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 That's something we're interested in.
There's so much you could do.
Any other questions?
There is some characters in your film, they're filmmakers too, like Gabriela Brandt and Benjamin Crotty. And I see some relations between these three practices of the films. And this relation of some cynicism in relation to the Hollywood films, and this kind of like reference to they're playing or kind of joking. I don't know. I know their films too, and I see some triangulation between these three practices. It's interesting to see them representing your film too.
Yeah. So there's in the France scene. Everybody in the France scene is a filmmaker. So Benjamin Crotty, Gabriel Abrantes, and also Mati Diop are all in that scene. And Mati's a great filmmaker, but it's really Benjamin and Gabriel who we kind of were like felt a real kinship with when we first like met them in terms of like their filmmaking practice. So we met them in Rotterdam, and it was when we had Blondes in the Jungle out, and we had no idea what we were doing. It was our first film festival, and you have to go to these like meetings where you're gonna have like mentors, and we had this meeting with a mentor, and she hated our work, and it was just like a chore to sit through, and it was just like the worst thing. But then apparently she also had a meeting with Benjamin and Gabriel because they had a film together, and she was like, guys, I don't know what you guys are doing, but you should probably meet Lev and Whitney because you guys seem to be the same thing. And so we met them, and we're like, oh, like this is what festivals are for. And yeah, I think they make fantastic films separately and together. And yeah, I think that we have parallel practices. I mean, like the whole time we were making this film, we were asking them for advice about how they would do something or how they would put it together. Their end products, like they're kind of like we're all kind of going off in different directions. I think we have a sort of more push and pull interest with naturalism than they do. I think they're like totally happy living in the world of affect. Or Gabriel does. Benjamin's definitely doing both. But yeah, like there are people who like I think are speaking the same language as us. At the same time, that scene was sort of a tough one for us to be shooting emotionally because it's like sort of the whole project of us making this anthology film was we were like, we don't want people to feel like, oh, that was a great scene, but geez, how many more of these do we have to sit through? So our kind of like goal was to make all the scenes sort of unsatisfying on their own and instead have to rely on all the other ones to kind of balance out. But it was really embarrassing to go meet with these other really good filmmakers, Mati and Benjamin and Gabriel, and give them this script where it's just them saying like, I'm so mellow again and again. And we could tell that they were like, okay guys, like sure, we'll do this, you know, but they like could not quite see what the project was. And like, you know, sort of like every night as we kind of finished the shoot, they'd be like, so Blondes just seemed like a much kind of like tighter project than this. And like, we're just kind of trying, they're just trying to be like, we don't really see where you're going with this one, you know? And meanwhile, they're showing us, like, they're like, oh, do you want to see a rough cut of our film? And they're all like, wonderful. But yeah, so that was, it was wonderful to see them, and they're good friends, but it was a tough shoot to be at, too. So I hope that answers your question.
I don't know, I just feel it's a generational, I just think it's a generation point of view in directing, too.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're all the same age, and I definitely think that that's true, right? Like, there's something about us, like, not taking some things as seriously as previous directors did, or seeing some projects as being dead ends that older generations of independent directors might, like, think are, like, worthwhile projects. And, like, with all of us, like, I think there's way more of a kind of just, like, relaxed attitude about pop culture. Like, it's neither a sort of, like, you know, emphatic embrace, nor is it some sort of like knee-jerk criticality. Like, it's just sort of like that's woven into the, like, our fabric of references as much as any other, like, avant-garde or art reference might be. So yeah, I think it's probably generational.
Yeah, it makes sense in relation to picking up the 90s.
Yeah, like the moment, she mentioned that the 90s were like, that makes sense. And yeah, it's like the moment of our childhood and the moment of us becoming, like, aware of media, and also, like, when independent film was, like, relevant. And so, like, that's when we can sort of look back to as a place that we can sort of build on. Anything else?
Anything really pressing? All right, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for sticking around.
Thanks so much,